So we've completed the first half of our course and learned really the fundamentals of programming languages. Things like variables, data types, conditional statements, loops, functions, and we've moved into specifically things that are helpful for JavaScript, like the DOM traversal and working with jQuery. Now we're going to be taking some next steps into some more advanced topics, and we begin today with this one right here, loading data with AJAX. This is non-blocking loading with HTML, XML, and JSON. So we're going to talk about these things, and we'll get to look at a couple of new technologies, at least they might be new to you, XML and JSON, which I think you'll find are actually somewhat familiar already. So there's a bunch of things lined up here. There will be new syntax, keywords, variables, data types, operators, structures. Actually, I think I forgot to clean those out. So don't be afraid. It should not be that scary. All right, here's the overview. AJAX is it used to stand for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So that's where the AJ and XML AJAX came from. But now it's really kind of outgrown that. It's really just a term now, AJAX, for loading external scripts or data in a non-blocking way. So non-blocking or asynchronous, they're kind of similar concepts, but they mean that a request can be sent and other scripts can be processed while we wait for a response from the request. So the idea is we're going to want to call in some content from another file. That might be another file in our system. It might be a file or some kind of API or data service, things that we'll talk about in some upcoming weeks. But one way or another, we're going to have to kind of send off a request for that data, and then when a response comes back, because that could take a little bit of time for the request to make it to the server, for the server to serve up some content, and for that to come back to us, we are able to kind of then handle that data when it gets back. So there's a request that we send off, and then eventually there's a response that we can respond to and do some processing with. But of course the idea is then with the asynchronous or non-blocking approach is that we can send that request off, and while we wait for the response, JavaScript can continue doing other processing rather than sort of sending the request off and then kind of sitting here looking at our watch waiting for the response to come back. So this is a flexible way of handling things like this. It allows for a lot more activity to be happening, but it also means that pages load faster in general because we don't try to load everything at the very beginning. We load only what we need, and then we load additional stuff as the user requests it. So when the response is received, it then obtains the processing focus and is processed. So carrying on with what we were talking about before, we can fire off the request, go on making some other, doing other processing, but then when the request comes back, where the system is sort of notified, or JavaScript is aware then that it's back and it's ready to maintain focus and be processed. So yeah, it's kind of big picture, more of this kind of abstract things, but I wanted you to have an idea of what this idea of asynchronous or non-blocking means. As we go in, we'll be able to see examples. So the bottom line is that AJAX allows us to run complex applications from a single page by loading additional content on demand. It allows us to improve the speed of our scripts and page load by loading what the user needs as they request it. And it allows the data, it says that the data can come in from a variety of forms, from plain text to HTML, JSON, or other formats. All right, so let's look at what this means for us. But I suppose it would help to talk a little bit about what this whole XML thing is. So a little bit of XML. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. So part of that sounds kind of familiar, right? From HTML, the Hypertext Markup Language. So that ought to clue you in that there's already some overlap or some similarities here. So the extensible part, that's meaning that it is simply a framework or a set of rules for markup. The tags and content are really up to the author, so it's just a framework. So therefore, HTML is actually one library of markup based on the rules of XML. So you could think of it this way. XML HTML is to XML as square is to quadrilateral. So if we move to that domain for a minute, you might remember that quadrilateral is kind of a concept of a four-sided shape, right? So there is the parameter of what makes something a quadrilateral. A five-sided shape is not a quadrilateral. A three-sided shape is not a quadrilateral, but a four-sided shape is. So inside of that, we have lots of different kinds of quadrilaterals, squares, rhombuses, rectangles, just to name a few. So square is one particular instance of quadrilateral. Similarly, HTML is one particular enacting of the XML rules. These rules are the same three rules you learned in Web 1. The element rule that says elements must open and close correctly. The nesting rule that sets up how we can nest elements within other elements. And the attribute rule that describes how we can provide attributes on opening tags. But there is a new one that is also in play with HTML, but we just didn't make a big point of it, and that is that every well-formed XML document should have a single root element. That means all of the content should be contained by one root element. In HTML, that is the HTML element. Think about it. You have an HTML tag that opens and closes and wraps around all the other stuff in the document. The head tag, the body, and all the stuff in body are contained by that parent or grandparent HTML tag. Now that little doc type taggy that we put at the beginning there is more of a document type declaration that is also allowed in XML, but that's a different topic. So basically, if you know HTML and you know how it works, you add one more general rule that we have a single root element, and you've got XML, or at least the framework in which XML can work. But again, that extensible part means that we can really create our own tags. So check out here a little snippet of XML that could be used to mark up books in a library. We have a root element of books that opens and closes around individual or all the items inside. Then inside of books there are two book elements that each open and close correctly, and we've used the ID attribute rules to encode an ID value of book 001 and book 002 on these, and then they each have a title element, an author element, and a year published element. So you can see here that this is a framework that allows us to mark up all kinds of data. There's nothing magical about what I've done here with these. I just thought, hey, what are the objects that I need to store? Books. And what are the properties of these elements? Title, author, year published. The choice to put ID on as an attribute is partially that's kind of a overlap with HTML, but it's also a way of saying, hey, this is data that's kind of behind the scenes. It doesn't need to be visible like the other three properties need to be visible. So I encoded those as actual tags and the ID attribute as an actual ID attribute. So there's an example, and boy, the world sure opens up when you realize that a lot of data can be received and sent thanks to these rules. XML can be used in many ways. One of those is that we can treat HTML as XML. So I mentioned a moment ago that HTML is really XML. Well, that is mostly true. Today, with HTML5 in play, our browsers are flexible and allow us to break some of the rules of XML in the way we mark things up. So technically XML is just a little bit more picky, but HTML has at one time been based upon the rules of XML, and mostly what we teach in our web classes do conform as well. So when you think about AJAX and this idea of asynchronously loading XML data, that XML part really doesn't have to be scary. That can really simply mean loading some external HTML content. But it's also pretty cool in that you can use the rules of XML to create your own tags. So again, that doesn't need to be scary, like you saw on the previous slide. We understand the data that's related to books, and all we did is just use those data properties to mark up a document. You could do the same thing for any kind of data. The cool thing is that XML provides a structure for you to do that. And of course, you can mix and match using well-formed HTML as values or data that's inside of XML tags, and you'll get to see this on one of the things we work on here. But XML is not the only data type we can use. There is something else called JSON, and that might be pronounced JSON in some contexts. I've come to know it as JSON. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's a syntax for coding data independent from a JavaScript script. So it's going to be really similar to what we've been doing all along with data in our JavaScript files, arrays, objects, strings, numbers, booleans, things like that. But it allows for this to be a little bit more flexible by adding a couple of extra little things to it, you'll see. So it's used for storing and sharing data between pages, scripts, servers, and even between applications. It's really just plain text that follows rules for formatting that are similar to JavaScript objects. What we're going to change about it is that if you think of a JavaScript object notation, it's curly braces, opening and closing, that wrap around a set of property and value pairs. The property name is followed by a colon, followed by the value, followed by a comma, and then another property name pair. Well, with JSON, the only change we're going to make to that is that we're going to become a little bit more picky with the way that we encode each of the pieces. The property names always need to be treated as strings and therefore contained with quotation marks. The values need to also always be treated as strings unless they are either one of these types. Booleans, so true, false, can be left without string quotes around them. Numbers, true numbers, that is, numbers with a decimal place or that are integers, they can be left without quotes. And of course, arrays or other objects that are nested inside do not need to be put in quotes themselves. So we'll look at examples of this. So very much like what you've become used to with encoding arrays and objects, with just the idea of, if you're not sure, wrap it in a string. And JavaScript and jQuery have functions that help parse and convert JSON data to native objects, such as the getJSON method. We'll actually just be using the get method, you'll see in a moment here. So we've been talking about data, but the whole idea, keep in mind that we're bringing this all up is because inside of a script, we're going to want to call out to bring in some external data. Maybe we want to load a list of books. Well, rather than putting that list of books hard-coded into our script, maybe we're going to be retrieving it from a database in some way, and there's going to be some technology out there that's going to process that for us and package it as JSON data. Well, that's handy because all we have to do is call that service and trust that it's going to give us nice, neat JSON in return that we can then do our magic with. So here's an example of a JSON version of that same thing we looked at a moment ago, where there is an object wrapping around this whole thing. It has one property, the books property. That property contains an array of books or a list of books. So the square brackets wrap around 2 books. The curly brace sets contain each book. Each book has an ID, title, author, and year published. So it's the very same data that we saw in the other file a moment ago. In fact, here you can see JSON and XML side by side. There are benefits of one, that you might use one versus the other, but the key is you really need to know, likely it's going to be that you're going to be working with a data service. That's going to be the case in your project in our course. And you need to know which way the data is being packaged so that you can work with it correctly. Very likely in this course we'll be working with the JSON side because we have a little more flexibility with that, since it's basically JavaScript object notation, meaning we can do stuff with it in JavaScript that we might not be able to so easily do with the XML markup stuff on the right-hand side. But you can see they're very similar. The JSON is maybe a hair fewer fewer characters, in that we don't need to have the opening closing tags, but it is also very picky. We need to make sure that we always have the objects encoded correctly with the strings around each of the values that are needed. So anyway, there's your example. Okay, let's take a look at JSON data in the demo file that I have ready for you. So if you open it up, go to the data folder and look at product A and product B. Notice that these are two similarly structured JSON objects for products. There's a name, a price, and a description. So see if you can take that same formatting, those same three properties, and apply them to product C for practice with JSON. So if you want to do it on your own, go ahead and pause the video, and I'll continue with the demonstration of the solution. So the first thing is we want to make sure that the whole thing here is encoded in a curly brace pair so that there's one root object in this document. Then each of these are going to be properties, so we want to make sure to encode them in strings. This one here, though, is a number, so it does not technically have to be encoded in a string. And this one contains string content and HTML markup, so we're actually going to just encode it in a string just like the others. Notice that I put commas at the end of these two lines so that we truly have kind of a comma-separated list. Now, of course, we need to put the property names in the front, which each need to be encoded with a string followed by a colon, like that. So I think it was title. Nope, it's name. Name, price, and description. Okay, so there's some very simple JSON formatting for you to help you kind of get your feet wet with how to format those. If you'd like, feel free to create a new product D JSON and try it out from scratch yourself and work out any issues that arise. The color coding should give you a hint that you're on the right track. All right, carrying on with the presentation though, next we need to talk about actually doing some AJAX. What a concept, huh? The first one is going to be the load method, and this is going to load an HTML fragment, specifically an HTML fragment, into another element on our page. So if the idea is we're going to send off and request some content, receive that content and do something with it, the framework that wraps around that is that we're going to select an item in our current document. That's what's for placeholder 1. And then we're going to provide the path to or URL for some external HTML. And AJAX is going to go out and request that HTML and get it back. And when it gets it back, this load method is set up so that it receives that content and populates that content as the inner HTML content of the thing we selected, so the selector in placeholder 1. So some things to note about this are that it loads the content from that external file as is. There's not going to be any processing or any further dealing with that content. And it assumes that you have content in a separate separate HTML pages that you want to load into certain elements. So we're not dealing with JSON. Really, we're not specifically even dealing with XML. We're really in this case saying, I just have HTML that I want to bring into the page and stick into this element. Okay. Now there is a little variation here in that inside of this string that we're passing in, you can separate two different placeholders there. The first placeholder marked as number 2 here is the path to the desired HTML file. So that's going to be the actual HTML source file that we want to load in. But in placeholder 3, we can also provide a CSS selector that allows us to target a specific HTML element from within the file we loaded. So that allows us to go kind of deeper into the file we loaded and grab a specific element if desired. Usually that's more specific than we want, so just wanted to let you know that that was possible. There's also another variation that I've not put in the slides, but that we will work on in the exercise, where you can pass in a second parameter altogether, so outside of the string there. You would add a comma and then an anonymous function that allows you to have some custom scripts that are handled as a result when the data comes back. But we'll look at that in the exercise. Okay, so let's go practice with this. If you go back to the demo file and go to our index.html file, what we want to do is use AJAX to load sample.html, which you can see is a well-formed XML document. So it's really HTML, right? But notice that we followed the additional rule of XML to ensure that there is a single root element here. So rather than just having these two divs, we made sure to wrap the whole group with a single container. And it happens to be a Bootstrap markup for panels and panel headings and things like that. So we're going to take that content and load it, and we're going to want to populate it inside of this here div, the div with an ID of panels. So the structure is going to be inside of our DRE, we're going to have a jQuery selector followed by the load method. So what are we selecting? Well, we're going to select the thing with an ID of panels, because we want to load some external file and put its contents inside of that panels div. So which file? The sample.html file. All right, so plain and simple, we're selecting panels, and then we're loading sample.html and placing the contents right inside of panels. So I'm just going to comment this out as I load this so you can see what it looks like before the code. All right. So below details coming, we have this div that's kind of invisible in this page. There's nothing there now. But when we uncomment our Ajax call here, now that content is loaded. Pretty slick, huh? So if I go and change the content of sample.html, coming soon to a store near you, or to an element near you. Oh, come on. Okay, the Ajax loads that external file and brings it right in. Pretty cool. All right, so that is one thing we can do. One way that jQuery has made the Ajax world very simple and easy for us. For a large set of use cases where we simply want to load an external file, drop it right into our page, that's the idea. And so you'll get to work with this specifically on this lesson's exercise. But I want to also give you a sense that we can do more with Ajax. We'll cover more in a separate lesson. But one other thing we can do is to use the get method. So in this case, notice that we don't assume that we're going to drop this into an existing element on the page. Likely we're going to call some data, and that data might be used throughout our page. So we don't start with an actual jQuery selector here. All we do is we start with the $, which is the kind of global jQuery object. So we're just saying, hey jQuery, get this file, and when you get it back, do this stuff. So that's what those placeholders are. The placeholder 1 is for the URL of the content to load. So go get the content on this page, or the one referenced by that URL. And then number 2 is a function to be called when the response is successful, present successfully. It accepts a parameter that represents the response data. So that's an anonymous function there in placeholder 2, and we're going to pass in a data, a variable that holds the data that we get back. So you'll see that. So some things to note on this, that it assumes that some URL endpoint is set up that will deliver relevant content. Okay, so we can't just put on any old URL in here. Those URLs or pages need to be kind of either on our server such that we can access, or set up to be actual data services. And then the format of the content is broader than with load. With load, the one we covered on the previous slide, we assumed we were dealing with HTML content and we were going to just put that right into an element. With this method, the get method, we don't know exactly what we're going to be getting. You, the programmer, have to know what you're getting and be prepared to deal with it in the function that you put in placeholder 2. So therefore what you do with the content is loaded is totally up to you. So let's look at what we're talking about here. So whereas with the first example we were just loading HTML content and putting it into the panels object, with this one we're going to try to load one of our JSON files here. Okay, so we're going to start with $.get, and we're going to pass in a string and a function. The string needs to be the path to the file that we want to load. So this could be an actual URL to some data endpoint. We also have several data endpoints right here in the data folder. So we can point to, say, data/product a.json. Okay, so now onto our anonymous function. This allows us to pass in a variable that represents the data we get back from our service. So let's console.log data. So notice that this is gonna run instantly when the DRE is finished. So when the DRE is all ready, this jQuery request is going to run right away. Actually, the panels request is going to run first, and then this get request is going to run. But they should both be pretty instantaneous. We'll pull up our console and refresh. You can see what's logged by the response. So the response is actually, look at this. It's a nice, neat JavaScript object. It has a name, it has a description, it has a price, which is exactly what our object here has. Okay, so that's cool. We loaded this. Well, now what do we want to do with it? Why did we load it? Well, perhaps what we want to actually do is not just log that info to the console, but maybe we actually want to take those three properties, price, name, and description, and put them into our page. So how would we do that? Well, we have these values over here in something like data.price or data.name or data.description. Okay, those are all properties we can get to directly as child items of data. So maybe what we actually want to do then is use these to write into, say, the price field here. So I could select the price field and write its text content, just like we've been doing all through the course with data.price. All right, let's take a look. So there you go. The 10 that we had encoded in as the price for product A is getting displayed on the page. So you can see the difference. Product B is $12. So if I change and load product B instead of product A, I should see the 12 there. Now, of course, it's not formatted like actual money, so we can do similar things to what we've been doing all along, where we add a $sign and concatenate it on, and then we also do .toFixed and pass in 2. So things we've been doing all along, all we're doing is just changing where we're getting this value. It's not a variable we declared directly in our content. It's data we're loading from a whole different file altogether. There is $12. Okay, so we could do the same thing with price and description. Okay, except of course we're going to select the name class and the description class. And note as well that description contained HTML content, so we want to write the HTML content of this element rather than just the text content. That way, the markup that we have in the description will actually be processed as HTML. And there you have it, product B, $12, and our Latin text there. So what if we change it to product C? So this is where we'll find out whether we've each formatted our JSON correctly. Remember we had worked through this earlier. Well, looked like mine's okay. If you have any pause here or errors, that means that there's something wrong with the JSON that you put into product C, which you'll want to just double check. But there you go. So let's kind of broaden out and think about how we can make this a little bit more useful for what we're doing here, where maybe we have kind of tabs. We want to change out which product we see based on whether we've clicked on product A, product B, or product C. Okay, so now we're going to want to put a click listener between these two things. So we're going to select the, let's see, pagination A's when we click. Oops, I'm sorry, that's the old way to do it. On, click, call a function. Okay, so we're basically going to move this Ajax now so that it doesn't happen right away, but only when we have clicked on one of those links. Okay, so now when we click on a link, we're going to get some data and populate it into the page. So let's just test it. It's not done yet, but we're just going to test. If we refresh now, we should see all the default stuff until we click on a product, and now we see the actual loaded content. But it's not loading the actual page we click, so we've got to do a little bit more magic now. We've got to figure out how to tell JavaScript, or let JavaScript figure out actually, how to get the correct data from the one that we've clicked on. So you'll get more practice with this in the exercise, but notice that the way that I've encoded this is that it actually matches the file name for each of these products. So if I have clicked on one of these A tags inside of my event handler here, I'm going to call e.preventDefault. Make sure that the default behavior for the link does not happen. That's just a safeguard. And then we might do something like var product name, is assigned, and we're going to go to the e.target as a jQuery object and get its href attribute. And I used single quotes there for no particular reason. Change them to double quotes just to be consistent. Okay, so let's console log what we've got. Let's just see which one we click on. Okay, so good. We're on the right direction in that we can kind of see which product file we should load, except that there's that pound sign in the front. So let's strip off the pound sign, which we can do by just going right on here and replacing pound with nothing. Now product name contains the version without the pound. Okay, so that looks exactly like the file name. So what we'd want to do is take that little variable, product name, and we'd want to put it right in here instead of hard coding a name in. But of course, if we've got a variable, we're going to want to concatenate it in like this. So see how that's data slash, and then the product name we got from the clicked element, and then we have the extension last of all. So let's take this whole little bit and put it in its own variable, product file name, and then we can console log product file name. I'm going to comment all this out until we've ensured that we've got the right thing going. So now when we click, we should see just the name and then the actual path to that file. Okay, hey, that's looking good. So all we need to do now is uncomment this and actually pass that path variable into this first property. So remember, this is just the path to the file we want to load. So we've created that over here. And now we should be able to actually see each product load on click. So there, my friends, you have a little bit of JavaScript, and you are ready for the exercise. Good luck.